Welcome at Parents Art Gallery this afternoon. My name's Stephen Munn. I'm CEO and Artistic Director of Absolutely Cultured, and we are producing the FloodLights event this weekend. There's an amazing image here. 3 new digital commissions that are being presented at Princess Quay, 51 White Frigate and Trinity House Academy, and they're all exploring Hull's relationship with water. So it's a really exciting time, and the weekend's going to be absolutely incredible. But first of all, I'd like to introduce our amazing panel this afternoon, a heady mix of artists, academics, funders, and industry professionals. So can I please ask you to introduce yourself?
My name's Briony McDonagh. I'm Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Hull. I'm the lead for the Risky Cities project, which have been involved in the FloodLights production.
And I'm Lee Pitcher. I'm Head of Partnerships at Yorkshire Water. But I'm here today in my capacity as the General Manager for the groundbreaking Living with Water project.
My name's Mark Fletcher. I'm the Global Water Business Leader at ARUP. We're an international consultancy, and I had the idea to come up with a city water resilience approach that we'll hear about later.
My name's Denise Fahmy. I'm the Visual Arts Relationship Manager at Arts Council England, and I'm the lead contact for Absolutely Cultured. And good to have a chat with you today.
Hello, my name is Tom Newell. I'm from a creative studio called Limbic Cinema, and we have been commissioned by Absolutely Cultured as one of the artists for creating the piece for FloodLights.
And I'm Vicky Foster. I'm a poet and a writer and a performer from Hull, and I've been working with Tom and Limbic Cinema on one of the projects that are part of FloodLights.
Brilliant, thank you. So the panel will explore this afternoon the role of arts and culture in addressing the major issues that face wider society. How can we raise awareness, engage communities, influence behaviour, and bring about change? So in the context of this afternoon's discussion, there will be a focus on flooding. We all recognise the immediate need to adapt for change here in Hull. In Hull, the local authority declared a climate emergency in 2019 and have stated an aim to achieve a net zero carbon position by 2030. I personally believe that arts and culture has an important role to play to facilitate resilience and adaptation in communities. But there's a balance to be had, I think, in terms of the need to entertain and create spectacle, but also where that meets messaging. The need to engage audiences and take audiences on a journey in an inclusive way and not coming across as preachy or off-putting. So I'd now like to invite the panel to talk about the specialist areas of work for 5 minutes. So Briony, would you like to start?
I would. Thank you very much, Stephen. So by training, I'm a geographer and an environmental historian. I work in the Energy and Environment Institute up at the university. And one of the kind of research themes that I and colleagues are engaged with is around living with global environmental change, risk and resilience. Through that work, we're engaged with Living with Water, with Lee, in ARUP's City Water Resilience Framework, which I know Mark will talk about, and engaged in things like ARC, the National Flood Resilience Centre, as it will be. So I work with physical geographers, flood modellers, people concerned around renewable energy. But I'm a humanities scholar, and the projects I lead come at some of these issues that Stephen has flagged from a rather different angle. So Risky Cities, for example, evaluates the effectiveness of using arts, learning histories and heritage to work with and engage diverse communities in raising flood awareness and building climate resilience. So we are concerned to use, for example, histories and fictions of flooding in one flood-prone city, Hull, as a way to do arts-based community engagement and large-scale artistic interventions, including Absolutely Cultured's FloodLights. So in terms of what I've learned over the last couple of years about the value of arts and humanities as a way to drive forward change, I'd point to kind of three key ways in which I've seen this happening. For me, arts and humanities approaches offer opportunities to educate and inspire, to tell familiar stories in new and arresting ways, and perhaps also to tell stories that might be difficult or troubling or hard to sit with in ways that people can engage. Secondly, we know from research that people tend to think about climate change as something that's happening elsewhere, as about polar bears and melting ice caps, rather than about our experiences here in a city on the edge of the North Sea. Stories that are geographically and historically grounded in a particular place, well, for me, that offers opportunities to bring the big stories down to an individual level, to offer people something that is relevant to them. And we know if stories are relevant to people, they're much more likely to engage in behavioural change and in action. And ultimately, that's what everybody here is working towards. Histories of living with water and flood in a city like Hull, as I say, on the edge of the North Sea, here for 800 years, continually experiencing episodes of flooding. Those local histories offer us opportunities to ground things in place, but also for us to learn from the past in building for a better future. So I think arts, culture, heritage offers opportunities for us to build for a better future, to work on community and personal engagement and action, perhaps to build communities of solidarity, not in the wake of disaster, but in the face of an uncertain climate future. But arts means different things to different people. We know that. You know, our colleagues, our artists all know that. Hence the importance of evaluation. So one of the things the Risky Cities project has been involved in, working with Absolutely Cultured to do, is to monitor and evaluate what happens today, what happens over the weekend, and you know, what works, what engages, what doesn't. So I will ask you all very nicely to make sure you fill in the monitoring and evaluation survey after this at some point later in the weekend after you've seen the work, because it's really important. It's important for us in gathering data, and most importantly, it's important for us in thinking exactly how we can use arts-based community engagement and large-scale interventions to build resilience here and in risky estuarine and coastal cities all around the world.
I've worked in the water sector pretty much all of my career. I was a lecturer for a little while in Russian. But underlying everything that I do is my love of music and literature and dance. And I guess where that comes from, and if I can share that story, when I was a young teenager, we unfortunately lost our home. And I was living in London at the time. And it was a really, really difficult time, as you can imagine. So one day I had a house, and I went home to that house. I had my neighbours and my friends and the community that I'd lived with in a little banjo, cul-de-sac, as we called it, a banjo. And that had been my life for many years. And unfortunately, for various reasons, we lost our home. And what that meant was I went to school that morning, and when I came home, I had to go to a different place. And for the next 12 months, my mum's sister and I lived in one room. And that room, to be quite honest, is no bigger than it was a 12-foot by 12-foot room. And I guess for me, my only escapism during that time was either to go for walks and be amongst nature, a bit like we've done over the last 2 years during the pandemic, or it was to hide myself away and listen to music or to read literature. I guess I just think about different things that were happening in my life and think about the future and be creative about what could be and what my ambitions were. And that has absolutely driven me. So I know for a fact the power of arts, both in terms of its mental healing powers, its ability to provide resilience, and its ability just to give you that inspiration sometimes that you need to pull yourself out of a really dark place and live a really fulfilling, thriving life. Now, if I play that back to where we are now, so in 2007, we obviously had the large-scale floods right across Yorkshire, but particularly in this area. And so many families were tragically impacted by those floods. And I used to visit people in caravans, particularly around Brownsome Estate at the time, and just talk to people. And the agony that they were feeling, the anger sometimes that they were feeling, was, it just brought back those memories that I had when I was little, and how, I just wanted somebody to give me the tools to be able to get myself out of that situation, or help me think a bit differently. I guess for me, what that then lent itself towards was a career in flooding and try to help people so that they didn't have to endure that in the future. So in 2017, City of Culture put Hull on the map. BBC actually put Hull on the map for the first time. And I saw my role back then, and has continued since then, to make sure that Hull stayed on that map, that it didn't disappear under the sea at any stage in the future, that people didn't disappear under rainfall that fell on Hull into the bowl and couldn't get it out. It was to work with those communities that we serve to do something different. And that different is really different, because actually, since 2007, there's been 10 years worth of investment by lots of different agencies that's made a huge difference and protected lots and lots of homes. But even with all of that, we still remain the second biggest flood risk in the country. So we have to do something different. And not only that, that is on the backdrop of, the biggest thing that's going to impact humanity ever, climate change. It's here, and it's going to last, and we need to respond to that, and we need to respond to it quick. And these next few weeks, actually, are absolutely paramount in terms of our consequential impact of the decisions that we make. I guess for me, in order to do things differently, that doesn't mean building the infrastructure that we've built in the past. There is a part for that to play: pumping stations, sewage works, bigger sewers, widening rivers, building up flood banks. All of that plays a part. But actually, going forward into the future, we need to start to work within communities. We need to understand what knowledge is out there, what education they can bring to the work that we do. And what that allows us to do is to co-create. But co-creation, in terms of building little ponds, in terms of building areas that soak up water, like mini rainforests, mini woodlands, all of that takes very, very close building of relationships, building of trust. And the one thing that I know allows us to build trust and co-create is to engage differently. And the way that we can engage differently is through pulling every single lever that is possible and there to us. 2017 taught us that the people of Hull, the people of East Riding, the people of Yorkshire like to get out to events. They like to get out and talk to people. They like to see the volunteers. So the way that we can use arts and culture now, in terms of the work that I do to respond to the flooding challenges that we have, is just phenomenal, because I know that the people of Hull and East Riding, they absolutely want us to come out and talk to them and co-create, but we can use the arts to find that thing that sparks that initial conversation, that brings people out to us, that allows them to want to engage with us and to work together going forwards into the future.
Thanks, Lee. That's great. Thank you. Mark.
Thanks very much. I've written down a narrative because there's quite a lot I want to say, but I want to get across. I live in Southport on the northwest coast, so I'm fully aware of the power of nature. I've lived in York when it's flooded. I've lived in Leeds when it's flooded. I've spent my entire career working on the extremes of the water cycle. Initially in the north, and now I work all around the world. in many ways, from Leeds to Shanghai, it doesn't really matter. I have my holidays in Beverley. I had an idea 5 years ago at Stockholm World Water Week to create a framework of understanding. Look at all the watery shocks that a city might get, flood or drought, stresses like sea level rise, so that cities could understand the challenges they face and work together to build resilience with the people who live there. This is called the City Water Resilience Approach. We've carried it out in Hull with Living with Water, but also in Cape Town, where they didn't have enough water, in Miami, where they dodged a hurricane, and in Mexico, where they're subsiding. So when I think about water resilience, I think of the resilient metal figures standing up, these elements on Crosby Beach. It's called Another Place by Anthony Gormley. It's like a sort of community facing the elements. It sort of represents the resilience that's needed. I also see huge hands rising out the canal in Venice. This is called, it's sort of holding and propping up a building. It's called Support by Lorenzo Quinn for the Venice Biennale. And yes, his dad was Anthony Quinn, the actor. I also see the stark beauty of the Yorkshire coast and the Hull flood barrier by Ian Mitchell. He's a Yorkshire graphic artist I've worked a lot with. If you go to COP26 or look it up on the internet, there's an amazing installation by an artist called Wayne Binnety from the Royal College of Art. It's called Polar Zero, and he's worked with the British Antarctic Survey and ARUP, and he's captured air from the year 1765 from an ice core. This date predates the Industrial Revolution, sort of a revolution that's provided benefits that's transformed the world, but it lit a fuse on emissions that resulted in global warming. Now, art has a huge role to play in exploring and understanding this. We commissioned a Yorkshire-based sculptor and artist called Peter Coates to explore this. His work's taking shape. It's called Starting Point, but it involved research in Iron Bridge, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. And when he looked at the Iron Bridge, and we all saw an iron structure, he saw a reflection in the water, and it made him think about the earth, which I thought was really powerful. And then he was working in his studio in Broadby, and Radio 4 on, and John Humphreys was interviewing Tim Peake, the astronaut. And he said, when he was looking back at Earth from space, he said it was like the Earth was surrounded by a fragile band of gas. And that was, for Pete, hitting the nail on the head in terms of what summarises our global situation, where we've abused the Earth we inherited and maybe the fragility of what sustains all life. When we created that city water resilience approach, I was mindful of the findings from the Pitt review of the 2007 floods, about the need for organisations and bodies around the city to come together with solutions rather than blame each other, being mindful it was the citizens and communities were hit by the floods, not those organisations. Art can help us understand, it can prompt discussion, evoke emotive reactions, and it can also help provide comfort. It can fill in the gaps when our own words just don't fit the situation or convey the feelings. It's an essential element of our humanity, whether giving identity to the economic regeneration of the North East in the form of The Angel of the North by Anthony Gormley, or reflecting the pivotal role Hull's playing in mitigating the causes of climate change through renewable energy, The Blade by Nayan Kulkarni. Art makes you think. Ask Banksy. Thanks very much. And this cover is The Great Wave of Kasagawa by Katsushika Hokusai. It seemed really relevant for this chat.
Did you just buy that in the gift shop?
And I just bought it in the gift shop.
It's all
$9.99.
a bit of merchandising, isn't it, really?
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. Denise, would you like...
Well, I don't know how I follow those three amazing speeches, but I am going to read from my notes. So I'm going to just start telling you, I work at the Arts Council, but I'm going to just give you a bit of a personal insight. This thing today about flooding, it's very pertinent to me personally because I was flooded in 2012. And it's true to say it really was an existential experience. Everything we'd built up in fact, that we'd taken for granted as a family, our possessions, warmth, safety, they were just swept away in a couple of hours. We had nowhere to live with 2 children, and we had a very, very long haul ahead, and it was a deeply traumatic experience. One of the really confusing aspects of the experience, which I think actually today you might have helped clarify a little bit earlier, but I'll talk about the confusion, was trying to understand why it happened. When it came to thinking about how to stop flooding or to stop what had happened to us, it was really confusing to even begin to think through that process. We were at the top of a hill. We weren't near a river. I've since learnt that is palluvial flooding that we experienced. But how could we have stopped it? There wasn't really one reason why we were flooded. There were many reasons, and a lot of them I just didn't understand and really couldn't tackle at the time. And although this affected our whole town and it was a collective experience, everybody experienced it in a completely different way and were in very different circumstances. So really quite slowly I realised that there just wasn't one way to stop flooding. 10 years since that event, our local authority and other authorities have put a lot of money in to mitigate against that event in the valley that I lived in. And they've undertaken work that some of which has been very complex, which has seen the demolition of homes, some of which has been very simple, but was still a major design process. But the problem was the council couldn't stop the rain. They could mitigate against its effects, but they couldn't stop the rain. I mean, with our neighbours, we took a bit more of a steampunk approach. We just fixed a bell in a bucket and hung it down into the mill pond that had flooded us. If that bell rang, we got the sandbags out. And we did get the sandbags out. So that was quite effective for us. But back to the bigger question, why had it happened? It's hard to accept that there isn't a simple way to stop your home being flooded. You can't overnight stop climate change. It's a challenge to realise that the whole world has to take political, technical, long-term action, and that we also have to take it individually. The problem we've found is that there isn't a master plan for everything. For an individual, how do you fit into that master plan? Where is it? Now, coming back to my job at the Arts Council, it's clear that in our country, our culture, our arts and culture, our sector has a role to play in averting environmental degradation. So we expect all of the organisations that we fund act responsibly or can demonstrate that they're environmentally responsible. We've got a 10-year strategy out, and as part of that we're publishing our environmental responsibility strategy in line with COP26. We also want our organisations to as we've talked about here, to advocate for environmental responsibility and to be leaders in being able to explain what climate change is, but also, as Stephen said, not to preach, but to educate and to help learn and to help share those experiences. We believe that arts and culture is uniquely positioned, as our other speakers have said, to both educate and entertain. And so we play a critical role in helping to alleviate the effects of climate change. And I know the sector has already made changes to reduce its carbon footprint. So, for example, we have a programme called the Spotlight Programme, which we developed in 2018. And the Spotlight Programme offers targeted support to a small number of our national portfolio organisations. Those are organisations that are regularly funded by the Arts Council. And those are our largest organisations, such as the Royal Opera House, the National Theatre, Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums, and we support them to come together to bring down their emissions. And in the past 2 years, through that peer support and through peer procurement processes, they've brought down their emissions by 18%. Now, I also know in my own sector in visual arts, with organisations and with artists, the sector's thinking really deeply about how committing to net zero must change the industry. So we've got to think about touring. Touring has to change. Exhibition making, it's got to reduce its waste. Producing work nearer to where it's presented and how work is produced. These are all critical to how our sector can really sort of deal with the things that in the past we've thrived on, such as internationalism, moving works around the globe, installing endless panels of MDF and then ripping them out and starting again. We've really got to start thinking about how we present that work. Today's artworks at FloodLights demonstrates that art is emotionally resonant, that it moves us. It does allow us to consider both global scale and domestic minutiae simultaneously. A year after I experienced flooding, I saw Adam Shadoska's work. It's called Rising. It was commissioned by the Great North Run and an NPO called Invisible Dust. I saw it in 2013. Rising is a live performance in which runners of the Great North Run in Newcastle have adapted physically and psychologically to an aquatic environment of flash flooding and rising water levels. This work was inspired for him by the flash floods that he saw in Newcastle in 2012, in which the Tyne Bridge was struck by lightning, and by an extremely bizarre turn of events. I actually also witnessed that event in which the Tyne Bridge was struck by lightning. Luckily, and predictably for me, I was standing at the Baltic Art Gallery at the viewing station and saw it happen. But extraordinary, 1 week later, I was also flooded. And when I saw the work by Adam, I was still camping out as a result of that flood. So it was this incredible kind of collective feeling that this ridiculous phrase, we're all in it together, but that there was this communal experience that people were having, and we need to be able to channel how we both respond to that work, but how we make changes. I mean, I've changed my behaviour. I mean, I stopped driving 10 years ago. My children don't drive, and they won't be taught to drive. I always live near a bus stop. It's much better than living up a hill. And to be honest, I'm happier for it. I'm more flexible for making that life decision. So we all have a role in bringing about change, but my view is that the arts also have a voice to help people to make that change and a responsibility to commit to net zero. Thank you.
So to kind of give a background a bit of where we came from, we are a kind of collective of video artists who predominantly were creating accompaniment to music, essentially. We were kind of creating visuals and lighting to accompany DJs and bands at festivals is kind of how we started. And that work is really abstract in its nature. It's kind of a lot of time just kind of moving form and colour. But what it predominantly did is kind of showed us an environment where people are experiencing the art collectively. It wasn't in a gallery, it was in a public space that people were coming together and experiencing this in big numbers. That process, but I think what it also taught us is that, it came from a world that has happened so quickly. It was a weekend or an evening, and then that was kind of over. It was a very impermanent art. And so we wanted to use those skills and the experience that gave us, but in a way that could have more legacy and potentially more meaning, something that lasts for a bit longer and hopefully connects in an audience in more of a way than just perhaps like hedonism or more escapism, which I think is absolutely needed in our lives. And I think when Stephen was talking earlier about art having a role, I think absolutely we need that in our lives, that it is something out of the ordinary and provides that escapism and provides a spectacle. That's kind of what we were doing. But it also has the opportunity for connection, I think, and it's about that connection of audiences that I think we are kind of drawn to, and we've kind of wanted to look at how we can make things more memorable, those experiences are kind of memorable, but how can that memory translate into something that people can take away that perhaps would inform a behavioural change or an action or thought. And so I think something like this, given being commissioned by Absolutely Cultured, is an incredible opportunity because it allows us to use some of those skills and techniques and platform, but with a subject matter that has a really important aspect that needs to be communicated to an audience. And our work that we do is, I guess, by its nature, public art. It's very rare that us ourselves would do something in a gallery, and so we're kind of bringing that to spaces, I guess, that people are familiar with, perhaps not as daunting as maybe galleries or theatre spaces. It feels like it's the opportunity to bring that into a realm that people are familiar with, like town centres. So for this piece, we are transforming the old New Look space, which may be familiar to some people here, but we're able to transform that and do something different with it and bring something new to that space. But retaining the idea being that that's retaining that kind of collective shared experience, I suppose, in the hope that people leave with something to kind of talk about between them afterwards, or particularly in this case, reflecting the shared experience of being flooded, and if we can kind of reflect some of the things that we heard and were given to us as a kind of way of research that inspired this project, if we can sort of reflect that in a way that is meaningful to people to take away, then I guess we've maybe achieved something. But I think one of the things as artists, if I can use that term, which I again struggle with, that the balance, as Stephen was talking about earlier, is the challenge, I suppose, the most challenging aspect of how far to go in terms of having an impact and it being that kind of memorable encounter, but also in a way that still is kind of entertainment and a bit of escapism, and not just another way of kind of receiving, the news that we do so much. So if there's a role, I guess that it would be to kind of offer up that reflection and perhaps a different viewpoint or perspective in a different way that people can then take away to ponder, I suppose.
Thanks, Tom. Brilliant. Vicky, can I pass on to you now, because you guys have been working together, but obviously you're from Hull, spoken word artist. Would you like to reflect for 5 minutes?
Yes, so one of the things that I've been doing in my work for the last 5 years is firstly talking about difficult things and difficult experiences mostly in performance of spoken word. And also I've been working on a lot of kind of place-specific commissions that have been mostly in Hull. So figuring out how to engage with a specific audience in Hull. And in terms of this project, to me, I think there are a number of barriers to people maybe wanting to engage with the idea of how can they personally help to stop flooding. I think obviously it's an economically deprived area which feeds into other social problems, as I'm sure most of us are aware. So people here have probably naturally got a lot on their plates already, and it's probably quite natural for them to think that flooding is a big problem, too big for them to be able to think about personally, or that it's somebody else's problem, like the council or the government. And I think what we can do as artists is help to find ways to get past that. I think art is like a really effective and useful way of doing that. And as artists, I think what we have done on this project, and that what we can do generally, is by putting an audience at the centre, at the forefront of the work as we're planning it, is we can start to address some of those barriers and move through them. Like I say, if people have got a lot on their plates, then I think what you've got to kind of think about is that you're not giving them an extra thing to carry. And I think by presenting these ideas in art and creating a spectacle and something beautiful that people can come and engage in, what you actually do is you switch it from asking people to give something to you in terms of help and changing their own behaviour, and you turn that on its head and turn it into giving something to them. And we know from City of Culture and Freedom Festival and a lot of the arts events that happen in Hull that people here are willing to do that, they want to do that, and they enjoy it and will engage in it. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. And I think, if you just said to people, come and sit down, we're going to talk about the floods, people will struggle with that. So that was the first point. The second point is about being respectful with the subject matter. So I think it's a great thing to talk about difficult experiences and difficult ideas, but you need to be respectful of an audience when you're doing that. And a subject like flooding in a place like Hull is obviously one of these things we've got to be extra careful with, and we've talked a lot about this as we've been working on this project, because a flood, as people here have just expressed, they've experienced it personally. It's a traumatic experience, and you've got to acknowledge that. I think that can also be another barrier to people wanting to engage with talking about flooding, because people don't want to just sit down and go over this really difficult thing that happened to them. So again, by presenting it in art, we've got an opportunity to kind of get past that barrier as well. Yeah, one of the things that the Limbic Cinema project does, Sinuous City, is there's an element of the installation that depicts a flood. And we talked about this at length, really, about what was the best way to do that. And I think firstly it was important that that did happen, because in some ways it felt disrespectful to kind of skip past how difficult it is to be flooded, and it offers an opportunity to make an emotional connection with the people who are coming to see it. I think again that's the thing, as has already been discussed, that art is really good at. Like we hear in song lyrics, or we see in movement, something that feels familiar to us, something that we can latch onto, that we recognise. And so that's one of the things that Tom and me alongside him have worked hard to do in that representation of the flood. But what we've also been very careful about is that we address the other ways that we can think about water. So firstly, it doesn't drop people into the middle of this difficult experience. People don't walk into it. We start out thinking about the different ways that we use water, because I think one of the things that's been discussed a lot is kind of addressing the overall relationship that people have with water. It can become one of fear when flooding's happening a lot. And actually, you know, obviously there's a lot of uses for water, so we've incorporated things like brushing your teeth and having a shower and putting the dishwasher on. These are all things we do with water. So we start out with that and we move towards flooding, but then we don't want to leave people in that difficult place. So then we have used all the methods that Limbic Cinema use, that Joe, the composer, can use in music, that I can use in words, to move people through that. We're acknowledging it, we're making a connection, and then we're moving through and past the flood to think about ways that we can, people in general, can start to make adjustments that can help with flooding in the future. So within that, I think the whole experience of the Sinuous City installation takes about 30 minutes. And within that 30 minutes, we're covering all of this ground. We're breaking down these barriers. We're moving through these different stages of thinking about it. So I think it's fair to say that art is like a really efficient and effective way of doing that. You can cover a lot of ground in a really short space of time.
Thanks, Vicky. No, I think just listening and thinking about it from our Absolutely Culture's point of view and where we are as a cultural organisation and the kind of learning shift that we're on with all of this, you know, we want to be ambitious, and it's that thing about ambition up until now, I guess, in the arts, internationalism, global learning, touring has always been really part of ambition, and to have to try and rethink what the definition of ambition is now for an arts organisation, I think is really interesting. I mean, we run a venue, we run a gallery, we've got a visual arts programme, you know, and that entails touring work coming in there, and we commission as well exhibitions. But it's how we look at recycling the wood, the resources that we've got, and that whole thing about reusing as well. But I do think there's something around, if you think back to the 70s when Pink Floyd was on tour, or, you know, the more trucks, the better, isn't it? You know, you count the trucks equals success, and the whole thing about scale equals success. And so it's how we look. Bigger is not better anymore. You know, it's how we really look at what success looks like and what ambition looks like. So that's something we're looking at. And with the Arts Council Environmental Responsibility, you know, we are really having to examine ourselves as an organisation with our board. Lee Pitcher is now our chair of our board, so not from a cultural background, but from an environmental background. So we're addressing our organisation from the top down, from the root up, really trying to see what change we can make and difference we can make. And it also kind of fits with the partners that we are looking towards in the University of Hull, and the academics and research. And I guess my question for Briony would be, it's that thing about where research meets practical working, and how do we really do that? The learning and the words are there, but how do we actually do it? And I know that you've recently recruited a creative producer. Yep. Well, welcome to our world. So what does that actually mean for you?
I'm hoping it means things are a little easier and I'm less busy with a fantastic creative producer on side. So it's been a massive learning process for me doing this and attempting to bring what was the germ of an idea that came out of a conversation between, I think, Lindsay and I sort of 2 years ago into this. And this is all new for me, you know. I'd been to see Vicky's work in the past and thought it was great, but I didn't know what working with artists to do something like this would be like. So I think there are huge barriers, just as there also are with the communities we're talking about around communication and translation and making sure we're all talking about the same thing and understanding us. It's an uncomfortable process as well. As an academic, I find it hard to let it go and, you know, normally we write something and the book, you check it, you get to say, no, that isn't right, I changed that. And that's a really different process here in that I listen to Tom and Vicky and I'm like, it sounds like it feels like it worked at this point. But it's hard kind of handing things away and seeing what comes back and I'm sure it's hard for them having me say, this is what I meant. But I think it's been a productive and exciting process, but I am very glad to have a creative producer on board working on the Risky Cities project to hopefully, I say at this point, hopefully do this all again in the future, I think.
Brilliant. Would you just talk a little bit about your working relationship with the National Youth Theatre as well? Because that's a national company, for goodness sake.
Yeah, so Mark mentioned COP a little bit earlier. We're both going, as are various other colleagues. And yeah, I'm really excited. So the Energy and Environment Institute, the university, the Risky Cities project is partnered not only with Absolutely Cultured, but also with the National Youth Theatre. And we're taking a newly devised piece up to COP, to the Green Zone. It's called On the Edge. And it's about exploring young people's experiences and eco-anxiety in the face of climate change. On the Edge has a sort of dual or even triple meaning. It's about being on the edge of a moment of change, of needing to do something different. It's also about young people in coastal and estuarine communities like Hull or Withensea who see that change, see the threat of global climate change. And it's also about looking outwards, looking out into the wind farms that I think Mark mentioned in the North Sea, kind of the Holderness, Hornsea wind farms, and that idea that we can build forward to something better. We are very, very short on time now, but there is still an opportunity to do something differently, to learn at this moment and to make the decision we're going to do something differently. And I think young people's voices are hugely important in that. We shouldn't be speaking for any of these communities, whether that's communities in Hull who have high socioeconomic deprivation and low social capital and all of the difficulties that Vicky's pointed to, or whether it's young people. We need to listen to their voices, and we're going to take them up to Glasgow. And I really hope Boris and various of the people are there to listen and to see and hear and understand our young people's perspective.
Brilliant. Thanks, Briony. Just staying with COP26 for a minute, Lee, you've been involved with the Eco Battle Bus for COP26 and just wondered about arts and culture. Did that play a part in your thinking when you were involved in the programme there?
Well, it certainly did. It certainly did. In fact, standing outside the battle bus on Monday morning and actually taking a selfie, because I love a selfie, people will know this who know me, took a selfie outside that bus. That's been the, other than actually talking about Hull's connection and female connection in Hull to the maritime history, yep, that has been the biggest retweet that I've ever had before.
Really?
Yeah, because
with a big blue bus?
With a big blue bus.
That's what
Now, the reason for that is because it comes back to what Vicky was saying. You know, that bus now symbolises a different time, a different change, and hope. Yeah, because people have a hope that in a couple of weeks' time, something huge is going to come out of that, something bigger than what happened in terms of the Paris Agreement, that is going to take us forward into a new time where we actually really do get to grips with what we need to do. So yeah, most definitely we did think about it, and we thought about it, you know, through the work with Marketing Humber to think about how do we set off the zero carbon bus coming, and all of the people looking at the Humber, how do we set that off in the best possible way? And we use cinema to do that. Yeah, we use cinema. So because we know that sounds, noises, visuals, different people, stories, being able to visualize the future, being able to pull it back to where we are now, all of those things matter differently to different people. So it was a way to actually grasp an audience, and I think you used the word create that communal experience. I think that was really lovely actually, Denise. But it created, for us, we wanted to create a communal experience where everyone in that room, whether it was the visuals or the sound or the pictures, they got it. They realised what it was to have the eyes on the Humber. So most definitely it was really, really important to us.
Yeah. We talked about Lorenzo Quinn's peace support at the Venice Biennale earlier, but also, you know, this Extinction Rebellion did Our House is Flooding, and they floated this house down the Thames, which was a really powerful piece with powerful messaging. There was a piece called As the World Tipped by Wired Aerial Theatre as well that was incredibly powerful. So I guess it's that thing about, you know, we have said about this thing about balancing the spectacle and the messaging, but it is that thing about the impact protests can have through art activism, I guess. And I know, Tom, I'm going to kind of come back to you in a way, because have you got any thoughts around that?
I guess the key word that comes up for me when you bring up protest is that idea of disruption. And we talk about art kind of disrupting daily lives and the status quo. And I feel, obviously, protest by its nature, that's what its aim is to do, particularly in Extinction Rebellion's case. And I think there are some great examples of using that platform to disrupt our kind of environment visually in a way that creates memorable images, essentially. And I think that impact creates something that people recognise, and Vicky was talking about earlier that communicates something incredibly efficiently. There's an image there that represents something, and that can communicating something, that idea, almost instantaneously, and then that can be shared all around the world now with social media. And I think that then builds a unity behind that idea that hopefully instills in people that they are part of something or can be part of something, and it's not just them. That then maybe can lead to change.
What's the piece that Extinction did? Was it the Red Women, or what was?
Yeah, so I think maybe we should.
Sorry. Yeah.
So they have the Red. This is going to sound awful, so I can't remember the exact title, but they have the Red Women, don't they, who walked around different cities, and I think it's just that costume is so striking against the usual urban environment that we see, that people kind of instantly understand or recognise, I guess, just where that comes from and that cause, and is potentially instills something that they can get behind, I suppose.
Can I win now, just maybe Mark and Denise, just in terms of that, the role of protest, and it is happening, and whether it's Extinction Rebellion or Insulate Britain, there is disruption going on. Is that a good thing or not? Because it's really a divisive topic, really. Mark, what's your thoughts on that?
I'm glad you've gone to Mark first.
Yeah, thanks so much. My personal view, having been on the Extinction Rebellion march with our young water professionals in Leeds, I think if you're trying to convey concern that you're not happy that the government's doing what you want or that society's not doing what you want, I think it's got a valid place. Once it starts impacting on other people's lives, who themselves should have a free choice whether they protest or not, I'm not convinced. Stopping the M25 or an ambulance in a traffic jam and somebody dying as a result of that, whether that's justified, I sort of struggle. But I think people wouldn't be protesting if society was responding to their needs in the right way. Yeah. And therefore, I think you've got to, in a democratic society that we've got to allow protest, and we've got to listen to that protest. It's not just a token thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, that's my personal perspective, anyway.
Of course. Denise, have you anything on that?
I think I bristled a little bit when you said that it encourages you to be part of something. And I suppose the problem is if you're not part of something, are you then outside the message? And there's that alienating. So I don't feel you should have to be part of something to not use plastic bags anymore. So I think sometimes protest can kind of create a fence around the thing that you just want to encourage people to do. But I suppose it all goes hand in hand, doesn't it? It's protest, it's legislation, it's popular change, it's attitude change, but it's also the arts. And if I think about, one of the biggest changes that's happened in our society, that gay people have equal rights, that has come about through the arts and through protest and through legislation. And, massive attitude change in the past 20 years, which has created a more equal society. So the way that story came through the arts was quite subversive. There was illegality at the time. So, so I'm a little bit hesitant, as you said, Mark, about protest that then pushes people outside the message.
Yeah. Thank you.
I do think, though, that, what we're talking about here are levers, aren't we?
Yeah.
And we're talking about all the different levers that you can pull. And some work for some people, and some don't work for others. And that's why I think you need all of those types of levers that you can pull within your toolbox. And some of that's about disruption. Some of that is about connectivity to something that inspires some sort of emotive response. It's very different. I mean, I've got to say, and just give you an example of me today walking in here. So I've told my story today about where I've come from, and I've told that many times before. I walked in here today, and I don't know if it's because I walked into a gallery and it's got different lighting and a different ambience, and saw the wonderful paintings and the photos around us. And I walked in, and I feel very different.
In a good way?
In a really good way, but quite emotionally different.
Yeah.
So telling that story today made me feel quite emotional. And that's the first time I've told that and felt that today. And I can't tell you why that is.
Yeah.
But it's because I think the connectivity with just something that I have a deep-rooted passion about.
Creative.
And it can make a difference, So, yeah.
There's a photographer called Edward Bertinsky.
Yeah.
You may know his work.
I don't.
And what he does, he looks at an environmental problem, but he looks at it initially close up, and then he moves to a scale where it becomes beautiful. It might be 100 meters in the air.
Yeah.
And the photographs that he creates get you to think very differently about the problem. It doesn't mean that the problem's not there. He uses it in a way to engage people about what it is. And one of the things he does, I think it's in Johannesburg, he goes across a road. There's a road where on one side there are huge houses with big gardens, and the other side it's like a township, and there's no space, there's no green space at all. And in one picture, it transforms the way you think about an issue. Now, I think art can do that. You could take the war poets.
Yes.
Something that was so horrendous, and we're in a climate war, something that's so horrendous that through the poetry of the war poets, you can dramatically change the way you think about any future war or what else that you would do within the world. And I think there's something about that role that art has to play.
Yeah, and you don't have to bang someone over the head with it, do you? It can be subliminal, or it could be... Briony, did you want to come in on?
I think disruption's a really interesting word. It's one that's resonated throughout our work with the National Youth Theatre, who absolutely, the young people there want to disrupt. They want to tell their story and their views, and to have it heard that they feel that our generation hasn't done the right thing in many ways in protecting their future. So I think it's a word that I had not thought about in the context of art before I started working on these projects. Strangely, before I did Environmental Humanities, I used to write about the history of protests. So, you know, and one of the interesting things is that protest is largely unchanged for hundreds of years. It has always been about people in a space which is difficult and disruptive and you don't want them in. And that method, that strategy of protest has consistently been the way that protest has been articulated for hundreds and hundreds of years. So again, we can look at the past and learn, think forward into the future.
There's a real alignment here, I think, to future infrastructure.
Yeah.
So we're talking about arts and installations, but you know, in terms of preventing flooding in the future from a living water point of view, we're talking about the building of blue-green infrastructure. So, you know, rainwater harvesting, new gardens, areas in roads that soak up water, so green areas, new hedgerows, all of those sort of things. Now, actually, they need maintaining, yeah, and they could be maintained, quite rightly, by the organisations that maybe put them there as the infrastructure. But actually, how amazing if it's owned by the community, so that every day it's been looked after, but it grows further, and it has its own, almost has its own legs, you know. So there is something about how do you empower people and communities to want to own these things themselves as well, because that ownership's really important to make it sustainable for the future. Yeah, it's just absolutely vital. So I think the other thing that I'd say, Stephen, as well, I think there's a role here now in terms of digital media as well and art, and I think that's quite an important one, really. So I was thinking about when we wanted to make a statement 3 years ago. No one knew about living with water. It was a totally new concept. And 3 years ago this week, actually, I was, and I'm not going to recommend this, so because it had lots of safety things in place to make sure everyone was safe. But we did the ultimate, where we had the biggest, well, the only, I think, the first ever worldwide assault course through the city of Hull. And that had a lot of parts to it, but one was swimming through Princess Quay. So, as I say, please don't do that. It was, there's lots of safety stuff in place to allow that to happen. But what I would say is, the reason that we did that was because, A, it was a big spectacle. It got people out. It allowed us to talk to people face to face. But actually, it showcased this city. It showcased this city and its relationship with water. So all of those obstacles were water-featured obstacles. That was deliberate. You know, some of them were absolutely beautiful in terms of what they looked like. But actually, the pictures that we got from that, of the city, of the Minster, you know, of the square, Victoria Square, amazing. And actually, that just went viral on social media. You know, so I do think digital media and the use of that to get the message out there in terms of launching something is also really, really important. So I think that's where art plays a massive part as well, in just that immediate discussion with a whole population of people.
Yeah.
So,
I think one of the things I found really interesting about doing this kind of work is working out where the misconceptions are. And there's a huge amount of interest and goodwill, and you know, people want to do these things often. It's hard and there are barriers and we need to work around those. But also, sometimes people don't really understand how these various things connect together. And I know academics can be boring. We can, you know, fail to put it in ways that it needs to be. We can be overly concerned with the detail, but it's also really interesting in a lot of the work I do that you see people saying, oh, it's about whales and plastic, and I kind of think, in some really distant way, that connects up with climate change, but it's not that we save the whales and we solve the climate crisis. And so we need better communication around those things, and there's all sorts of ways that communication can take place, but it is that the arts and arts intervention can do some of that work.
How the Arts Council thinks about environmental responsibility, which, as I said earlier, is going to be a principle by which we make investment into arts organisations. And by that I mean that if we don't see that an organisation is providing evidence of its environmental responsibility, then we won't put funding into it. So it's quite a big shift, really. And I mean, that sounds quite threatening. But what I mean to say is if we don't see evidence that organisations are moving towards a net zero approach, then we won't fund them. So what does that mean? What it's tended to mean is we've got mechanisms to help organisations achieve that. So we work with an organisation called Julie's Bicycle that will offer you a data toolkit to help you to record all of your data that shows how your organisation's changing. So that provides some evidence base. But then there's also something that's really interesting in working with them, as they're helping the arts to kind of change alternative, economies. So there's new businesses coming up that are servicing the arts, that have a circular net zero production method. You know, so things like, in visual arts interpretation and panels and plastic that you put on windows saying what the show is. What are they called? I can't remember what they're called. Anyway, you know what I mean, David. There's companies now that have basically essentially been seed funded by the arts to develop a circular economy that they will provide you with recycling, so that your all of your bits of paper and your print, your interpretation is net zero. So the arts is part of an economy that is growing new businesses to help us to meet net zero. And one of the ways that the sector has done that is partly through collaboration. So we've got a number of consortiums that have come together in cities, and perhaps this is something to think about in Hull as well, which we've seed funded to come together and start having sharing sessions, but then have worked with production houses or with energy suppliers or to find ways that save them money and deliver net zero targets. And one of the other outcomes of that process has been, there's a morale feature for staff that are engaged in that, because they feel they're really making a difference and they are actually growing new knowledge in the sector. And the second thing is that we've seen the rise of new types of posts in arts organisation. So, just thinking Manchester International Festival have just hired an environment manager, sustainability manager role, but then they've got like dedicated expertise and new roles are growing up in the sector. And I think that's quite exciting. It's an opportunity for our sector to really look at change, work with partners and work with expertise in other parts of the economy. But actually as organisations, we're going to see completely new roles emerging, both in our organisation and with artists. So I think that there is, and the other thing is these consortia are also setting targets which are difficult to achieve. So there's that constant challenge as well for themselves. So I think it's quite exciting.
Yeah.
Stephen, the addition that I'd make to the question as well is that everybody receives messages in different ways. Yep. Some children learn by being much more practical. Some children learn by reading, some by visual, and I think the other thing to remember is that within different demographics, within different cities, you do get people that have maybe a reading age of of 20, but you might get some people that have a reading age of 10. That's just how it, how it works. And actually what the arts can do is get those messages across in different ways. Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen this, Vicky, in terms of the work that you do in particular. It's a way of engaging and getting messages across really quite pertinently with children or families that maybe can't take that message in a different way, or in what's a traditional way, or a traditional way of thinking.
Well, it feels important, and I think the fact that it is the term art kind of allows a freedom in that interpretation. I would say that actually it's not, maybe how it differs in academic work is that it's not as black and white, and actually people kind of don't come to it with the sort of apprehension that they need to understand it fully. It's kind of how they take away from it, what they take away from it, and it's not like you understood that wrong, you didn't get that right kind of thinking. Not that all academic is like that, but I guess there's a sort of freedom in to take away what you want from something, and I think that maybe allows a sort of softer jump-off point to the knowledge, perhaps, that there's a kind of way in to a theme or a subject that is a bit softer than just saying this is what you need to understand.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and I think it allows difficult and troubling information to sit with an audience in a way that isn't the same if we, say, when we look at the climate stripes and we see it getting hotter and hotter and hotter, arts and culture and visual arts and experiences, like Vicky was saying about the flood experience, offer different ways to take what you can from it at that time and then maybe come back and take something else, take new information from it at a later date. So to allow people to work through it in their own ways and in their own time.
Okay. Mark, did you have a final point on this?
Well, I was thinking about data. You triggered something, because I was thinking about citizen science, and is the arts equivalent of citizen science Instagram? Is it something where we're visually sharing virtually messages or things we want to influence people using a medium? Because I get an awful lot of fantastic creative ideas when I explore Instagram around a theme that I never would have thought of, and it's artists populating it. The only other thing is, I was thinking about food and localism, and something I think the shift in the arts is locally based, locally sourced, locally connected, and maybe somewhere like Tate Modern is the example of a repurposed power station that is now completely open to everybody to share and engage with. And sometimes we need some examples like that to make something real.
It takes a lot of time for all of us to get together and for those messages to be heard and to be heard by the world leaders to make that difference. But what I would say is you can't ever underestimate the power of all of those people saying the same thing at the same time constantly. And I know that's really difficult, but it does make a difference. We've seen how that can make a difference. I mean, the whole reason we're sat here today, the whole reason the Waterline exists and has had, events all week, the reason that COP26 bus came to us in Hull is because they're listening to us. They are hearing us, but we just need to keep plugging away. So, my view is we could just never give up. We've got to keep going.
I think there is a whole thing around cultural education and in terms of the e-back and what's happening in school and how artists, and there's a respect for art and culture and how that is fed up through the school's education into the institutions, that I think is kind of broken at the moment in a way, but that's a kind of, a whole area. Mark, you and I were talking just before it started. You were talking about the Angel of the North, and you kind of talked about, what we see and what's under the ground. I wonder if you could just say that again, because I found that quite fascinating.
I thought it was quite interesting how the public see the Angel of the North, and they'll see what it's conveying. They'll see it as a statue, probably something about a sense of pride in the Northeast or something like that. Our engineers saw it as a huge challenge where all the problem was in the ground. It was all on old mine workings. There's a whole different story that you can look at depending on what your perception is. And on so many things, when we have a problem, if an engineer sees it, the problem will be different to an artist or an environmental scientist, or a social scientist, or an economist. And too many things in life we look at very binary. We think of it just from one perspective. I think we've all got to be a bit more considerate of each other and think around that a much wider range of perspectives. And in that, I think an artistic perspective is as valuable as any other perspective, and I think it's often missing when we're looking at interactions with our environment.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. Okay, we're going to round up there. Could we just have a round of applause for the panel?